Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Lord Caledonia, and I was supposed to get a different video out this week, but life happens and it's still in the research phase. So today I want to talk about something a little bit more simple than my last video, and that is, simple figuratively I guess, why do arms and armor change over time? And the answer to this might seem pretty straightforward, but in reality, there's about three answers to it. And those three answers are technology, culture, and tactics. So, in the beginning of quote unquote recorded history with Herodotus, you have Greek warriors in bronze. And they would continue to use bronze, which is a softer metal, until iron eventually came along and we went from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The reason we made that jump is because we came up with smithing techniques where we could actually mine and use iron. You see the typical change from the bronze weapons and armor to the more iconic, maybe, Roman gear, chainmail, gladii, that sort of thing. But that's obviously not where we stopped evolving in terms of arms and armor, and we moved on into steel. And the way that we moved on into steel was we started creating furnaces that could actually infuse carbon into iron, which made it stronger. And that's how we got things like this spatha, which is steel. Steel would have been expensive at the time, and it eventually would take over all arms and armor going forward for a few centuries, millennia. But that's obviously not where things stopped, right? We have this, but we didn't stick with this. It evolved into something like this. Now, these look really similar, and in fact, you can see just barely one's a little longer, but this is, technically speaking, a superior invention to that. And this came along in the sort of early Middle Ages. We're talking, quote unquote, the Viking Age, the Anglo-Saxons, that sort of thing. And everything kind of was evolving at that point to move towards, longer weapons, have a little bit more of a heft, and more protection on the hands. And as I said, technology played a huge part in that, but also the culture was changing. The way that people were fighting were changing, tactics were changing, and you see in terms of dress, in terms of kit, people are wearing different things. No longer do we have the Roman army that's very, organized, and you have, your hastati, your triarii, your equites. Now you're getting more infantry. Missile is kind of being developed with inventions like the longbow, which will come, the standard longbow we think of will come a little bit later, but you move towards shield wall warfare, which would necessitate longer weapons and shorter ones too. Weapons like these, this seax, would have been invaluable in a shield wall. This originally developed as a tool, so there you have culture. It was used to cut rigging on ships. In fact, the word seax, I believe, originally comes from the phrase sea axe, which this is not an axe, so I don't know what they were thinking on that one. But in a shield wall, this was invaluable to get around shields. You could slice out legs, you could chop over, but this was still, the de facto choice for a lot of more wealthy warriors. Most people in a shield wall probably used axes, spears, and then had one of these with them. But again, things don't really stop there. And eventually, things needed to change. As warfare got changed with the invention of heavy cavalry, well, I shouldn't say the invention, but the popularity of heavy cavalry with like knights that the Normans brought over from mainland France, and with ongoing conflicts, things started to take a change, and weapons started to look a little bit more like this, and you have the cruciform guard. Now, a lot of people will tell you that the cultural reason for this is because if you flip it especially, it looks like a cross. And there is no evidence, so that's why they picked these up. In fact, I believe there's evidence predating European weapons having a cruciform style guard in the Muslim Near East, which is a little ironic why we even call it a cruciform guard, because cruciform comes from the word cross. But this is a superior technology, once again, to this. I mean, you can see how much more hand protection this one offers versus this. And not only that, by the time that these were rolling around, armor itself was changing. Chainmail was getting finer, was getting stronger, especially in Europe, and there needed to be a change. Which is why when you look at these two weapons, the arming sword, this one in particular, comes to a very fine edge. This is to get through mail and to find the weak points in armor. And in fact, that's also why we went from the Sayax to something like this. This is what we call a sword-hilted dagger, because it's got the cruciform style. It's not the only kind of dagger they had. But you see, once again, it comes to that really fine point. And this would have been used not just in civilian life, but also in warfare. It's designed for war. This could be used to get through armor. Of course, it's not where we stayed. We eventually moved on to things like a rapier, which I don't have an example of that anymore. I rehomed mine, but I'll put one on screen. And rapiers cover even more of the hand, and in fact also serve to fight back against the myth that the arming sword I showed earlier, that cruciform guard, was there to represent the cross. Because some of the most Catholic, Christian nations out there started adopting the sort of basket hilt on the rapier earlier than others. For example, France, Spain, Poland, all of these would have adopted it earlier. And rapiers, as you can see, come to an even finer point as armor, got better and better. We went from chainmail to coat of plates that had these overlapping pieces to all-out plate armor. All of these things would have necessitated that weapons grow up with them. And eventually we got to gunpowder. Gunpowder, not originally, but after a few centuries, sort of made the idea of fitting out a huge regiment of soldiers in large steel plates outdated. Gunpowder could go right through it, and eventually we dropped steel plates altogether and moved just towards cloth, like you would see with later musketeers or in things like the American Revolution. Now, I've talked about, tactics changing and technology changing and a little bit about culture, but you can still see a through line of culture. Not all arms and armor of a certain period look the same. A Milanese plate set does not look like a plate set from the Holy Roman Empire and vice versa, and they don't look like the French sets, they don't look like the English sets. But my favorite example of these is with Scottish swords. See, in the Bronze and then Iron Age, the Celts, the people that were all over Europe and now reside in places like Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, Ireland, Scotland, they had a unique form of swords which had these anthropomorphic hilts. I'll show a picture on screen. Some of these kind of look like antennae. They look really, really cool. I'd love to have a replica of one. But that look wasn't lost throughout the centuries. And in fact, in the wars of Scottish independence, specifically the First War, you can see a version of this that has sort of survived through the centuries with these swords. And personally, I think there's a connection, and a large part of that is because the Scots were buying steel from France. They were buying the blades, and they were fitting their own guards on there because culturally it was thematic of Scotland. They would have also served a secondary purpose of being able to catch a blade a little easier, and you can understand why maybe that would be more useful in especially looking at the First Scottish War of Independence, the guerrilla style warfare, the hit and run tactics that happened. Maybe you didn't want to be burdened down with a shield, maybe you wanted to just take, your sword or your axe or your dagger or whatever light weapons you could take, hit, an English convoy and then vanish off into the mist. So this has been a really quick, easy overhead view. I want to talk more on the subject in the future, but I just wanted to set a base ground on this. Next video should be coming fairly soon-ish, probably in a couple weeks. I am very excited about the topic. It was, again, meant to be for this week, and just didn't get the research done in time, so that's on me. But I, once again, thank you for watching. If you like this, please like, comment, subscribe, and I hope to see you all in the future.